I really miss the good old days. Things aren't like they used to be. Why in the world are things getting so bad? I'm glad I didn't have to bring up my children in these days. The culture and the church have changed so much. Why can't we go back to the way things were? Well, whenever I'm tempted to think in this way, Ecclesiastes 7:10 humbles me, and as it comes to mind. It's in a series of Proverbs that King Solomon has written, and it reads like this: "Do not say, 'Why were the old days better than these?' For it is not wise to ask such questions." Why is this not wise? It assumes that in my pride, I have set myself and my ways above those of the present. It assumes God doesn't know what He's doing in the present. It's a dissatisfaction with the way God runs things. And it's in times of pain and loss, adversity and disappointment, like many of us have been going through the last couple of years. It's in times like these that we praise the past and forget its disadvantages as well as the privileges of the present. Politicians often say, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" It's always been this way. The next generation to come along will regard today as I regard yesterday. We're all living in someone's past right now. It's the arrogance of every generation to think they've got it right and all before them failed. But we know now, and we're doing it better than they ever did it before. Whether it is government or worship or fashion styles or music styles, whatever, every generation comes along and moves the needle, and they don't ask the previous generation for permission. Maybe the past was better in some ways than the present. But when you start asking, why was the past better? Be careful, you're beginning to deny the reality of God's presence in the present. If you think things are worse, do you think God is no longer in control? Do you think He hasn't brought you to the point where you are now and that He no longer loves you or has plans or purposes for you? To ask the question in Ecclesiastes 7:10 is unwise because it forgets God. Nostalgia is often a form of escapism, taking a vacation in the past instead of grappling with the present or looking in faith to the future. Perhaps we get nostalgic about places, or we hear a song on the radio that takes us back. Most likely we experience nostalgia for people or an intensity of emotion we felt at a particular time, such as a place where we first met our spouse or a moment in a worship service. There is wisdom in looking to the past in order to find the resources we need in the present, but the idea that we can implement the same measures and methods as previous generations in spite of how our culture has changed is to give in to the black hole of nostalgia. It is the choice between living in the past and learning from the past. When we live in the past, we demand from our ancestors a map for the way forward instead of seeing the past as a treasure chest from which we pull out the resources that we need. As Kyle David Bennett wrote, nostalgia hijacks memory. In nostalgia, one sacrifices the present and the possibility of the future as one squats in the past. Nostalgia implies that God is present in one moment and not another, or more perniciously, that one prefers to be in a previous unlivable moment more than the moment God has brought them to now. Do you trust that God has brought you to this present moment for such a time as this? C.S. Lewis said that nostalgia is the special emotion of longing, but it's always bittersweet. When we feel nostalgia, we experience a feeling of something lost. At the same time, it's a beautiful perception of what has been lost, and so we long for it. But here's what Lewis says: only children or the emotionally immature think that what they're longing for is actually what they're longing for. A child thinks his memory of that beautiful hillside gives him a lovely feeling. So if he could go back to that hillside, he would have the lovely feeling all over again, and for as long as he stayed there. But that's unwise. When you mature, you realize that nostalgia plays a kind of a trick on you. It intensifies your emotions. When you grow up, you realize that if you could go back to that hillside, it might be nice, but it would also be very ordinary in some ways, and simply going back to it wouldn't reproduce that intensity of feeling. Truth is, the beauty, the memories of our own past, they're good images of something we really desire, but if they're mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself. They're only the scent of a flower we have not found, C.S. Lewis says, the echo of a tune we have not heard. It's just news from a far country we have not yet visited. When you experience nostalgia, your heart is longing for a more beautiful person than you've ever met, or a more beautiful place than you've ever known. You think you're longing for the past, but the past was never as good as your mind is telling you it was. What is in fact pulling on your heartstrings is the future. It's heaven. It's your sense of belonging and home. That's what we are to long for. And that fits beautifully with the message of Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes 3, we see that God has placed eternity in our hearts. We're built for home, for a place we cannot yet see. And so when we get that flashing moment of nostalgia, it's like tiny pinpricks of that eternal home breaking through into our present life. Wise people understand God made us to long for Him and for heaven. Wise people don't look backward when they get nostalgic. They allow the feeling to propel them forward. They look up to heaven and toward their eternal home. Pastor John Claypool relates this memory. He writes, "Years ago, a thunderstorm came through southern Kentucky at the farm where my Claypool forebearers have lived for 6 generations. In the orchard, the wind blew over the pear tree that had been there as long as anybody could remember. My grandfather was grieved to lose the tree, which he had climbed as a boy and whose fruit he had eaten all his life. A neighbor came by and said, 'Doc, I am really sorry to see your pear tree blown down.' My grandfather said, 'Well, I'm sorry too. It was a real part of my past.' The neighbor said, 'What are you going to do now?' My grandfather paused for a long moment and then said, 'I'm going to pick the fruit and burn what's left.'" And that's such a wise way of working with the past. We do need to pick its fruit. We do need to learn its lessons. Amnesia is a sickness and not an asset. But having learned what the past can teach us, we need to pick the fruit, burn what's left, and go on. Because we are called, church, to walk by faith, not by sight.